Tell me when I'm live.
You are live.
Hello, everyone. Hi there. This is Steve Bell presenting another session of Ask the Expert. And this time we're doing scripting best practices. This is going to be a multi-part series, probably 3 or 4 parts in a row. And we'll be continuing in April and May with this series. With this, I'm presenting the things I've found out on the various instances that I deal with on a daily basis, customer and otherwise, and I'm finding all sorts of bad practices, semi-bad practices, which I'll get into a little bit here. Some are good practices that really could be better, things along those lines. But the idea is, what is a scripting best practice, and why would you ever want to implement one? All right, so again, my name is Steve Bell. I'll be the presenter today. I am a scripting expert in ServiceNow. I do several sessions a year with Ask the Expert. I have over 170 articles and videos, and I'm certified in a number of things inside ServiceNow. I'm also an MVP and have been for 4 years now. I work for Accenture. All right, so scripting problems. A lot of people tend to write fast saying, I'm under pressure, I've got too much to do, I've got things that I know I should put into the code to make it better, but that can be done at a later time, and they kick it down the road. So kicking the can down the road seems to be a mentality I run into a lot, where we'll go back and clean it up and it never happens. So I'll get into what is a best practice and why you want to implement it. We'll be talking what is an engineered script and getting into the actual software engineering side of what we do every day in ServiceNow. I'm going to be really hammering home internalizing some of these best practices and making sure that you understand how they're beneficial to not only you, but to anyone coming along maintaining your code at a later time. So thus the reasons why they'll be needed. So what are the benefits of actually putting in best practices? What are the benefits of doing anything along these lines? Why do we want to do it? Isn't it just extra bureaucracy? And I'll be addressing that as we go along. In short, there is no such thing as a detraction for a good practice, obviously. And anything you can do to make your code better and bright and shiny for the next person coming in to actually maintain it, then the answer is there is nothing but goodness out of that. So what is a peer review anyway? That's one of my favorite ones to throw out there, because I'll bet you if I ask for hands right now, none of you would be able to state that you do a regular peer review, or at least very, very few of you. We've implemented this in our practice, but it's not ubiquitous yet. And it requires some prep. So I'll get into that a little bit. So, okay, let's get started here. Number one pet peeve is bad formatting. Indentation that's just all over the place. Very difficult to read. No white space in there. Things aren't lined up, so I can't tell where things start and where things end. Along these lines, it makes it very difficult to maintain. There's an old programmer joke, and that programmer joke is, if it was hard to write, it should be hard to read. That is not the paradigm you should adopt. That particular thing is actually one of the worst practices you could go for. So obviously having well formatted code is the best way of doing things. So what's the solution to this? Well, inside of the ServiceNow text editor, you have a format button. This thing has problems. It doesn't always format exactly as you anticipate. Sometimes commented out code that you're using for debugging purposes will cause the formatter to indent too far on some things, or perhaps not indent correctly at all. And I've had this happen a lot. So I use Notepad++ for my personal editor when I'm fooling around with code. And then Sublime on rare occasions. Notepad++ will handle XML, JSON, a whole bunch of other things. And then it's got spell checking and stuff like that. Sublime, same thing, has all of it. Atom, if you're using Atom, has quite a few of those features built into it or available via plugin. So anyway, I use external editors a lot, especially with my script includes, which could be quite large. Okay, so bad variable function naming. I think one of my greatest pet peeves is to have single letter variables, A, B, C, D, E. None of those are informative in any way, shape, or form. Code should be more or less self-documenting. Don't go crazy with this. So like that top one, glide modal, you could put a GM in front of a variable and have kind of like progress viewer, GM progress viewer, and camel case it. That would be perfectly acceptable. The onload function just below that, user info 2, is absolutely useless to me as a developer. I mean, further down in the code, what does that actually mean? Why not just call it requested for? What's wrong with that? So, make the variable reflect what it is that has the value. So propagate that throughout your code. Your code should be somewhat self-documenting with the variable names. GA, another one of my pet peeves is to use GR or GA. Both of them are awful. They don't tell you what's going on. You can get lost. I've actually debugged code where I just started renaming the GAs and GRs and ended up with fixing the problem. Turned out GR had gotten reused further down, and the developer had originally written it, hadn't noticed it being reused, hadn't realized he was even doing it. He just used GR for everything, glide record, and that's a very bad practice, by the way. GR is considered a ding on the health check or health check reports that are available through ServiceNow. Do not use two-letter variables. Use descriptive variables, something like GA. I'll show you here in a second. Another thing that's kind of awful about this is the inline comments down there. I'll get to comments here in a moment, but I'll point out that those comments are totally useless. It's obvious that you're transferring a value of blank into an email, the email field. It's obvious you're blanking the phone number. Why do these things? As far as commenting is concerned, it's just nothing but noise. If you name your variables correctly, it'll help document the code. It minimizes the amount of comments you have to have too, but these are useless comments, and I'll get more into useless comments here in a minute. Okay, so some of the solutions. DD should be something like modal dialog or progress viewer or GM progress viewer, something along those lines. Something descriptive that tells you as a developer or as a maintenance coder coming in afterward what exactly this thing's for. I guess DD was something like dialogue, or I don't know. Didn't make any sense to me when I saw it. Okay, no comments. Now, some of this can be mitigated. Comments are probably the bane of programmers. They don't like them. They don't like putting them in, apparently. They like them when they're there, but they don't like putting them in. This is considered bureaucracy by a lot of developers who have to rip out code real quick and are always unhappy about having to go back and document their code. My feeling is doing to others as you would have them doing to you, the golden rule. I always put comments in, and I always take the time to do it. And I do it to illuminate a section of code that is difficult to understand, or that I may, I'm sitting here thinking of a medium or newbie maintenance developer coming in and looking at the code and not understanding a section of what's going on because it's complex JavaScript, or it's complex because I'm using multiple calls into the ServiceNow API. Comment your code. It's not hard. It's a good thing to internalize. You'll start doing it without thinking about it. And another way of doing this is I comment my code with the design information sometimes. So my functions, when I'm actually creating them, I'll go borrow the text out of the design document and slap it in there if it's, you know, just a couple of sentences that describe the functionality of the particular function I'm fooling around with. But comments are part of the documentation, and they are considered a very best practice. Leaving them out is what I term as lazy programmer stuff. Lazy programming is just not wanting to do it. That's really what it boils down to. It only takes you seconds to put in extra information. You're the one that's writing it, and therefore understand the functionality the best. And it should only take you a very short sentence to describe what's going on, and enough said. So anyway, you get the idea. I also highlighted other issues with this. I love that hello world parse. By the way, this is a real example out of real code I found out on one of the instances I've been working on. Another one I forgot to highlight here is this ARRES variable here. Love it. So that's not very descriptive as to what it actually does. You know, something like you know, what is that list you're looking at? So it's an object list of some sort. The answer is it's you know, whatever this functionality is. So I'm getting the user details. That could be the users or user list or something like that, and it would be very sufficient. So up here is where I get my clue as to how to write the variable names for this. But don't use non-descriptive variable names. This has absolutely no meaning to anyone. I forgot to highlight the bad comments down below too. Here's a cleanup suggestion. So I've got requested for as a variable. I've got a simple comment in here saying what I'm doing. I've got a, instead of using GA, I've got the actual name here. So it's user details. And then I'm doing a handle response. Notice it's marked as internal. This is nothing more than, first off, JavaScript doesn't know underscore in the front of a function name. It's nothing more than a programmer nicety that says this is an internal only function not intended for external calls. And it has no functional meaning inside of ServiceNow or JavaScript, but it does to any developer coming in and looking at it. So this is something I'm doing to help a maintenance developer understand that this thing is only internal and they can find it further down in the code base. So if you got a lot of code, especially in a script include, this is a good practice to get into. Stripped off all the unnecessary comments, and then down here I've got user detail. Notice, so now it's a useful thing, and I use user detail inside of my gform set values. So this is just one of the suggested cleanups. The other thing that's interesting here, and I didn't do it right, is this should have this will work, but I could have used a get XML answer, and then I wouldn't have to do this response XML blah blah blah. It actually comes back in the answer variable. So get XML answer is actually better than get XML. Both of those are what's called asynchronous calls. If you ever see a get XML wait, that is a bad practice. It has its uses, it's rare. This is an asynchronous call right here, and this is the actual function that will be called when it responds. So it won't hold the user up. Okay, noisy commenting. This is probably one of my greatest pet peeves of all, and I see it used very heavily in the code base. Do not do this kind of commenting. Okay, first off, it becomes obsolete the moment you make a modification to the if statement. So if I come in as a developer later on, I've got two things to maintain. I've got to maintain what's inside the if statement, and I've got to maintain this comment down at the bottom. And if you've got if, else if, or while loops or whatever, and you're putting that end while loop kind of thing down there, or you know, echoing it down on this tag on the bottom, all you're doing is noising up the screen. You're not actually making it easier to maintain, you're making it harder to maintain. ServiceNow.
Quick, Steve,
Yeah.
if you want to posted a comment, but I'm not sure at what point he was referring to, but he said array response with a little wink.
Oh, yeah, that was probably back here. This is array response. I'm very sure that's what that was intended, but you know, shrug. Maybe. It's awful, whatever it is. Okay, so inside, first off, get rid of those kind of tags at the end. You don't need them. When you're inside ServiceNow's editor, you'll notice this little triangle show up next to the if. This allows you to compress everything down and see where the end of things are. If you still are having trouble understanding where the end of an if is, port it over to your favorite editor and take a look there. My Notepad++ editor, for example, actually shows a line going for all the way down to where the end is inside of my editor. So there is no reason to comment the end or close of anything. And all it does is add complexity to the code and make it hard to read. So the cleanup of this is to get rid of the end comments altogether. They are not necessary in any way, shape, or form. I have a point system for when I go out. This is one we've developed internally, and I ding them probably about 2 points for every one of these. So real quick that, you know, it can build up to a significant number of points for cleanup inside of a particular piece of code. Code reviews. I want to hammer them home here. They are worth your time. They will catch a lot of problems. Developer explaining the code to another developer is an excellent practice, and it goes beyond best. It allows the developer to explain why they took a particular approach and also explain why they violated best practices for whatever reason, or they were unaware that they had violated a best practice, and the other set of eyes on it will be able to bring it out to them. On load, this particular one, another interesting problem. So I see this all the time where people leave in the template comment. So this is what's known as a template comment. When you create a brand new client script, let's say with on load in it, boom, ServiceNow slaps the template in place and this comment is inserted.
We also have a couple questions about how to name variables. Are there some guidelines on how what names to choose or use, or you have some suggestions? And then there's one more question after that.
Yeah, I've got some resources I'll throw your direction. I've camel case, and don't capitalize the first letter on your variable names. The names themselves should reflect what is being done, so what is actually being stored in them. Like this requested for example, is obviously the get value requested for. Everywhere I use that now, I'll know that is the requested for user. And you can even put user on the end of this. That's perfectly acceptable. I usually don't go over like 20 characters. You know, rarely will I go above that. I try to keep it short, but I don't do acronyms inside of them if I can avoid it. So I don't even use the GR, GA, you know, in this particular case, GA. I don't use it. You'll see. There's no reason to. User details tells me right off that I'm going to get user information. You know, GA in front of this is acceptable, but I usually don't bother with it. I like self-documenting code. I like being able to look at it and see what's going on. One of our architects was responsible for a lot of code out on one of our projects. I was asked to go in and backfill him. I went in and backfilled the guy, and his code was absolutely beautiful. It was an absolute joy to take over. Here's the real dig on this. I was productive the same day and conquered 10 different stories that were on the plate because I didn't have to go out and figure out what was going on in the code. I went straight to where the code was that needed modifying, and it was self-explanatory what needed to be done based on the story and the way the code was commented and written. And the client was absolutely blown away because they were expecting me to spend a week or so getting up to speed, and I knocked out 10 stories in the same day that I came on the project.
What about the underscoring? The
underscore, yeah.
Is that required?
As far as this underscore in front of an internal, it is not required. It is a nicety. It is something I do because I'm a nice guy, I guess. Whenever I see it, I look at it as a responsible coding practice. And I'm appreciative of the developer taking the time to name their functions that way so that I know it's an internal function as a follow-on programmer. So again, well documented. This is considered a documentation point because it says to me that's an internal function. As far as underscores are concerned, perfectly legitimate inside of the names because that's a ServiceNow practice. It is not a JavaScript programming practice or even a good practice. A lot of JavaScript programmers stick with the camel case type stuff and don't bother with underscores in their actual variable naming. But it's acceptable in ServiceNow. I don't ding my developers for using underscores in their names. So what I consider this particular commenting, leaving it in the template comments is an unprofessional side of things. It says that programmer was too lazy to remove the out of the box comment, for crying out loud. I see this all the time, usually on client scripts and business rules. And it tells to me, it screams volumes about the developer themselves not taking the time to erase a line. And this adds, just that little bit extra bit of noise. For me, it's an immediate red flag that the developer may not know what they're doing. So I immediately go back and start, combing through the code much more detailed to see if they did. I still ding them. This is like a 1 or 2 pointer on my list of things to, that come up and that need cleanup. But this is a cleanup item.
We had Julio ask, why not create the underscore handle response function outside of the onload function?
Oh, that's a whole different area to talk about. As far as some areas inside ServiceNow don't allow it, and it will actually come back as an error during runtime. So as far as this practice is concerned, this is perfectly acceptable. And in some places inside ServiceNow, for whatever bizarre reason, the eval that actually takes this text and turns it into runnable code sometimes has trouble with this function being outside. So it's arbitrary. I'll try it sometimes outside. This particular function, because it's directly relevant to the above code and will be executed as the last thing in the onload itself, I put it inside for relevancy speaking, and also for the fact that it will be the thing that's immediately executed. Now, as far as other functionality is concerned, this onload function up here, it should allow other functions to be tacked in underneath it. I've had issues actually with that inside of business rules. So watch out. It may not cause a problem to have this outside, but it may. It depends on how ServiceNow's written the eval handler. Geez, guys, quit dragging me back to that.
Sorry, I think somebody they type a little bit slower. Remember, we are just a few seconds ahead of our users because of the delay.
That's true. Okay.
And then Yasborn said maybe there's a feature request to put in remove the template comment.
Yeah, well, you'd think, based on this, type appropriate comment here. Yeah, actually, it's interesting.
And then he asked, would you put that handle in a script include? I think maybe he's referring back to the previous comment. The handle response function outside.
Yes.
We're getting lots of questions today.
Yeah, the handle, underscores on internal functions inside of a script include, absolutely. I use the handle, the underscore on a lot of stuff. So, all my internal functions will be underscored as a nicety to anyone who comes along after me, and to myself, because I'll come back in and I'll go, what was I doing? And it will be intuitively obvious based on the handful of comments plus the self-commenting code. And I'll be able to say, oh, that's an internal function. It's probably further down. I'll search for it. Sure enough, it's there. And then I'll make a modification to it. Now, if it's called, externally, it won't have the underscore. I won't put that there. So if if it's available to the developer base as a script include library function that I want available, it will not have the underscore. So you will never see an external, that's how I differentiate and how it's self-documenting in that regard. I don't have to put internal function above this in a comment. The underscore does that for me. By the way, this is a JavaScript best practice. The underscore is. So this is not something that's a ServiceNow necessarily best practice. It's a JavaScript best practice to do that as a self-documenting thing.
No more questions yet, except for that remove template comment feature
Yeah,
request.
this thing, like I said, this thing screams beginner programmer to me when they leave that in. By the way, a good way of handling this, first off, strip that comment out of there. Second, fill in the description field on your BRs. And did you know that client scripts have a description field? It's just not on the form usually. So it's a good idea to go ahead and add that to the form. And therefore, then then you can add the description to the client script. It's considered a good practice to do this, by the way. But all of and it's interesting, where most scripts, you will find a description field. So your script includes your script actions, so on, so on, so on. You'll find that that's available to you to put high-level functionality. I actually put my function reason comments up there. So normally people put a comment in front of their function itself inside the code. These days, I've gotten to the point where I put the actual function information like that up in my description. And it will be, here's a list of all the functions that are in this script include. And next to them will be that description of what the function does. I'll even put use case up there, usually how to use it, from how to declare it and utilize any given function inside, just as a nicety. I should probably show that on my next presentation. I don't have that on this one. Okay.
Sharon mentioned when you're new to ServiceNow scripting, it's helpful to have a handle on that script include, and also it's a better enhancement to have a description field on all scripting forms so that it can be documented, i.e. client script was mentioned.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that I'll get into in further on sessions, and you're quite right.
And is there a secret trick to make the description field visible by default on all form scripts related?
Well, it's on almost everything except for the client script side. So yeah, the trick there is, make sure it gets, it doesn't necessarily have to be, well, I usually add it in, since you have to be an admin to see a script anyway, I'll add it in as part of an update set that'll get propagated through production, because a lot of people end up cloning back over the top and you'd have to reapply. But I add it in as a part of the default base, along with a couple of view changes, like on if you're going out and looking at a list view, you always want the updated and updated by fields, which ServiceNow does not give you out of the box on scripts views, and in my opinion should. Someone want to put in another enhancement suggestion on that? I don't know how many times I end up sweeping through and putting updated and updated by on all of my list views. But anyway, those combination of things are all good practices to implement as permanent view bits of viewing for development and ease of development, speed of development, and so on. But you can add it to the form and get it in an update set and make sure it propagates all the way up through production, so on any clone backs, it doesn't get wiped out. All right, commented out code. This is a huge one. I usually ding them pretty good. 3 points or better. I have a 5-point system. 5 being, well, actually, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with 1 being, like a missing comment, and 5 being non-functioning code or incomplete code, or some obvious error sitting in the code that would cause a major failure. 100 says it's completely non-functional or exceedingly bad design, and I've never had to use that in our business. But 5s, I've had a couple of them. This is a 3. So why? Why would I be so harsh on people with this? Simple. First off, maintainability is very difficult with something like this. There's no comment stating why this was commented out. So if you got a piece of code that says, comment this in if you have to do the following, that's legitimate. You can leave the commented code in. But there is no comment on this saying why that alert is sitting there. There's no comment telling me why the if was commented out and why I might, not want to comment it in. It's obvious these are debugging statements that were left in and therefore should be removed prior to shipping to QA or production. Or even better, setting up some sort of flag that would turn these on based on, let's say, a UI script that would load in the parameters, or a display script that would load in the parameters, display business rule, that would load them in during load time of the form, for example. And that way you could do a policy, or I should say a property, sys property that would then turn the particular debugging statements on in the front end. I haven't written anything on that. I probably need to. I've got stuff on how to log for back end, but not much on how I do things on the front end. And I've got a lot of tricks of the trade that I use to turn debugging on for me in production without having to go uncomment code. So in this particular case, this is noise and actually makes maintenance more difficult and could cause serious issues if stuff was uncommented by a maintenance programmer who didn't know any better. So don't leave this kind of stuff floating around. It's a very bad practice. Notice that they also, whoever wrote this, capitalized the first letter in a variable, and this is a bad practice. Let's see, what else was there? Yeah, MGR doesn't really tell me anything. Matter of fact, I might misinterpret that as being a glide record. But anyway, you get the idea. You don't want commented code sitting around. You really don't. So I the best practice on this is just get rid of it, and it cleans up things tremendously. Now what's missing is comments. So you might want to comment in here, but frankly, this is a request type and it has to equal this text. And if it does, then I set this MGR, which is probably manager. It probably needs to be a better variable name. I would say yes, because I don't care for 3-letter variables either. And this is manager group details, so I probably would have said manager or modify group details, sorry. Yeah, if you were going to really make this right, but 3-letter, it would have been MGD, right? Anyway, I don't know. This is one I found. You get the idea. Okay, another one. So there's not a lot wrong really with this code other than, well, the stuff I've highlighted. So we'll get to that here in a moment, but this is all rammed together. Now, to the developer it created it, it's probably very, reasonable in the way it's set up, but it is not very readable to a maintenance developer that comes along later. And it'd be simple enough to be able to break this apart by adding just blank lines. So, for example, the first 2 are not related to the next 4 after them. So I'd probably put a space after this dot value, and or I mean a blank line, and I'd probably do a blank line after the weight and another, to surround my alert so that things get moved around so they're easier to read. With this being all jammed together, it's hard to tell what's going on except for read it one line at a time, just like the computer does. Last time I checked, people are not computers, so really readability is an issue here. Now, another couple of things. Never use an XML wait. This is a synchronous call that makes the user wait until things come back. That could be a problem and could cause usability issues.
Pedro asks, isn't the get XML wait deprecated?
It probably is by now because there's so many that are fiercely against the thing. Problem is ServiceNow uses it in quite a few areas in their code. So if it is deprecated, they probably have get XML set up to do synchronous and asynchronous. I haven't looked. I don't use it, so I don't care. If they change it, great. I'm all for getting rid of it. Don't use alerts. Alerts are modal, which means that it grabs the entire browser away from the user until the user closes out the alert. So if the user is doing things back and forth between ServiceNow and some other tab on their browser, this thing will grab the entire browser and keep the user from doing anything until they hit that OK button. The best practice right now is to use GForm. In this particular case, I'm, since it's an alert, it's obvious it's client side. So this would be GForm, add info message, or add error message. Alert is considered a bad practice in the JavaScript world now. And granted, lazy programmers slap it in, who know better. It's really one of those things that I give people like a 3 or 4 for that one, because if it yanks the user away from their screen or keeps them from doing things until you force them at gunpoint to turn that modal box off, then there's a problem. So the add info message and add error message are your best friends. I've written a couple articles on that. You can actually color them. They come back and they add it to the form, so you actually get it on the form. In that particular case, you want to use a clear message so that you're not building up, because they are cumulative and they will push the form right off the screen and fill it up with error messages or warning or info messages if you got them. So just want to throw that in there. I'll talk more about it here in a moment. The green is what my recommendation is for this particular fix-up. Looks like my indentation suffered on transferring this over here, so these bottom lines should have been indented to match with this var answer here. But you get the idea. It's obvious that there's now error checking with the try catch. I'm checking to see if answer is null. So there's important things here. I'll comment it out. If I have commented out code, there's a comment telling why it's commented out. If I have something in there that I want removed, and I can't get to it myself, the maintenance programmer that takes over from me will be able to go do it and understand what's going on. So I actually put the word debug on things I want, and I'll advise the developer who's taking over, look for everything that has the word debug on it in the code base and take care of that. So I code with the idea of I want programmers to have the best possible experience when getting into the code, and I want them to be able to get up to productive very quickly without having to sit down and dope out what I tried to do or what I was doing.
Would add info message work for an on submit client script?
It should, because it's still client side. It will on submit usually then goes off and triggers a bunch of things, and it depends if it's yeah, it will. And interesting enough, there's actually a strangeness that goes on, because if on your on the on submit side of things, if you're taken to, let's say, a another screen for a view, it'll put the messages up on that view. So let's say I'm on the on submit button takes me back to a list view. The actual messages will appear at the top of the list view. So you'll have to play around with it and see if it's going back to the same form that called it. The messages will appear at the top of the form. But yes, by the way, there's a gs.addInfo and a gs.addError, and those have the same effect. Whatever form is current, which means the list view or the form itself that where you did the submission, business rules are really great in that regard. You can put a gs.addInfo message and it will reflect it back onto the form. I use them all the time. If I'm actually messing around with front-end debugging, I'll use a 1-2 combo, and then I go and sweep out any debugging messages like that and info you see on the screen here. But there will be things like JS logs that'll be sitting embedded in my front end code as well. But you'll notice this is on submit. And the idea on the return on this is that it comes back to the form, in which case then these messages will appear on the form. If this though goes to a list view afterward, they'll appear on the list view. And they may not be relevant at that point. So that's the usage side that you got to play around with. I usually force it back to the same form. All right, too much white space. What's wrong with this code? This is an actual real piece of code that I got out of our code base, our client code base out there. And this is interesting. So the template function has been modified actually. When this was plopped into place, you can see the template code, and that's this comment that I highlighted here. But isn't it interesting? The white space, lack of formatting, all sorts of stuff. And if I'd caught our particular developers playing this game like this, I would have landed on them. Both feet, no mercy. So indentation suffered, and this is just very, this is very difficult to maintain, obviously. And this is a worst case example, but I've seen this done quite a bit. So this is a bad practice. It's so much easier to maintain going in and editing out all this blank space. And it should look something like this. Now, there's no comments on this, so obviously I haven't gone back and commented the code here, but I wanted to show just the difference between this, which is very difficult to read and understand, to this, which is much easier to look at. I did put the underscore CI load for the front end. I can't help myself. I've internalized all these things and I do them without thinking nowadays. I just, this is how this is supposed to be kind of thing, and I program accordingly. Notice the get reference has a callback for asynchronous. This is a best practice. Here's one I just added to our list of don't do's. I see this every now and then. Notice the highlight. In actuality, this is a Department of Redundancy department problem. In other words, the equals true is totally redundant. JavaScript, and all JavaScript developers are this way, and all ServiceNow developers are JavaScript developers. So by association, you should not be using this. If test is a true or false, this is a Boolean. So if test, true or false. It also has an overload on it. Those of you who are new to development, overload means it has two possible functionalities to it, or two functions to it that are actually done at the same time. Test inside of that if there, and I'll go to the next one. It actually will do a null check at the same time. So first off, is test filled in, yes or no? And next is test true or false. So the first one is definitely filled in, and the second one is it's true. So this is actually true and true. It has two values to it. But for all intents and purposes, the meaning is obvious here. So if test is true, then go into it. If it's false, it'll fall through. That's a JavaScriptism. Doing this tells me that you're probably a developer from a compiled language world, in which case this is the actual practice, and not having that there would cause an error. Things like Visual C++, C#, and also Java programming all rely on this as being in the case. This is not a JavaScript coding practice. Oh, went too far. There we go. Okay, huge pet peeve. This one actually gets a 4 in my list. not having, well, 5 in some cases, depending on how complex the code is, not having a try catch or a null check on variables can lead to extreme grief. You want to do what's called graceful degradation. You want to handle the errors. You want to deal with the problems. And here, this developer didn't handle a potential problem. If parent is null, it will probably be okay here, but if you do a parent.length or a parent.toString or something along those lines, boom, it will blow up with a JavaScript error. It'll throw it possibly in the log, but it depends on where it is. It'll end up in the system log, or it'll end up in the console someplace. And regardless, it may detonate and just quit functioning altogether on the client, or client side, or in the user or back end. And the only way you can find out what's going on in some cases is the error is eaten. It'll get thrown into the log.
We had a question. On occasion, you get a string with a Boolean, for example, true and not real Boolean. How would you handle that efficiently?
That's kind of what I was getting into next here.
Okay.
There are some ways of doing this where you can do what's called JSU Tool. JSU Tool has a nil and not nil functionality to it, and I usually use that. Alternatively speaking, you could do a .nil on the end. I don't tend to follow that JavaScript because there are other tests that you need to do, and .nil doesn't necessarily take them into account. You can have an undefined, and it will pass through on a .nil because it's not nil, it's undefined. So there are other ways of handling things. I look at this as a Boolean or a object test. If the object test is there, then I usually do a JSU not nil test on it. But this is the very minimum you should do.
And that will convert it properly for the
usage. Yep.
Okay.
And that's tricky. There's some other things along those lines. So it's
what
tricky.
about type of?
Type of, again, JSU is your friend. Not nil and nil. Now, warning, JSU is not scope safe. So if you're off fooling around in scope code, you'll have to take JSU and take out the package call that's in it, and then it'll work fine for you, but you'll end up absorbing that into your own library of functionality. I've actually written several functions like that where I've stolen the code from the ServiceNow base and messed with it so that it doesn't have those problems in it that keep it from being a scoped app. So JSU is one of those you have to be careful with. As far as global is concerned, works great. So JSU is your friend. I have other areas where JSU doesn't work. For example, if you're writing custom steps inside of packages, JSU is not available. In which case you'll have to do your own testing to see if the object is available or not. Custom steps are relatively new. A lot of people don't know about them, but there's a lot of code base that does not work inside of a custom step.
And before you went into this explanation, there was a question that also came from Sharon that could you have done if and then a ref locate loc.parent and have it be the same thing? Very good.
Yes, this is actually a very poor check right here. And Sharon, you're absolutely correct. Taking that not equals tick tick off actually improves the code because that's a null check to see if parents even filled in. If it is, then it will pass this test as well. So there's the real question: is this actually a good check? The answer is no. And Sharon's suggestion of taking that not equals blank blank off of there is a very good suggestion. It will be the same thing. So what she's saying is this piece right here, if it goes away, will it be a better way of doing it? And the answer is yes. So what would I turn this into? This. And this is without the JSU side. Now, the difference between the two is stunning. So you got this, which doesn't do any error checking to speak of other than to check for a blank. And this, which is very robust code and actually handles the potential problems available. Now, I threw in a couple extras there that are totally not necessary, but I threw them in anyway to make sure that first off, the variable is named well. Second, that parent actually exists. First off, reference location exists. Next, parent exists. And next, if it does, that I can now trim it because it exists. If you do that dot trim and the thing is null, boom. So in order to handle that last possible problem that could occur here, I've put the try catch in there with an add error message. This is not necessarily the best way of handling this. I would have probably done a JSU Tool not nil in front of reference location parent and been just fine. But this is the way I would do it if I didn't have JSU Tool available, perhaps in a scoped app. The other thing is on the catch, if you want to make sure that the thing doesn't continue, then put in after this line, the G-form add error message, throw error. Throw ERR. The reasoning is that you want it to stop. You actually want it to error out. Try catch allows you to recover, which is a huge deal on the graceful degradation side. If I'm in a loop and I don't want it to bomb out of the loop, I want it to keep going, try catch without the throw is your best friend. If you want it to bomb out of the loop, then throw from right in here. And that throw is worth knowing about.
Oh, wow, we got a couple more questions. Can you use the new error parentheses and runtime context such as script source, for example, business rule with line info, etc., and same person, reference location, parent, nil, parentheses?
Yeah, probably, if I understand the question correctly. Yeah, there's things you can do obviously to enhance this. That try catch is your last possible hope to catch something. By the way, an important side note, on server-side scripts where you're doing glide records, glide record eats its errors and will not return an error that a try catch will see. So you, as the developer, have to be super sharp when it comes to glide records. I've done videos on glide records. I've done a number of them, and I always, when I get to that point, I always say, watch out, because it's going to bite you if you're not careful. Try catch does not work on a glide record. Exception being encoded query and also messing up on some parameters. It'll bomb out and try catch will catch it. Usually I put try catch around the whole thing because I'm doing manipulation of the objects from the glide record, and some of those may be null, in which case I've got all sorts of stuff for handling that kind of situation. I'll get into some of it in later sessions. Okay, I've already covered alert, so I'll move on that because we're a little bit short on time here.
You're right, yeah. So
And
Osborne even said, can you differentiate on exceptions? So could you handle them differently depending on the type?
yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a whole bunch of different types. This catch is actually, there's 5 or 6 flavors of things that can go on here. So, I won't go into them on this session because I've got about 4 more slides to cover here, and I want to make sure I cover them. But yeah, there are different flavors of error handling for try catch, and they are worth getting to know. Number of times I use them, there's a system problem, potential system error that can occur. I'll slap that in there. And also I use finally sometimes, rarely. It has its uses, but you might want to study on the try catch finally handling inside ServiceNow. It is your friend. It is the last, it's your last ditch effort to try to find something that will possibly blow up and then handle it yourself. Notice I'm throwing something for the user to know. So the user's actually getting this message back. It's probably from a business rule. Nope, this is front end. So this is a front end thing. And the user will get a nicely formatted message saying, hey, something blowed up really good. Okay, get past the alert. Use clear messages, by the way, on alerts. This keeps them from stacking up. They do accumulate. and it looks really messy, and the user could become frustrated. Okay, my number one pet peeve is lazy programming. So, you know, one of those things that I look for is, did the programmer actually take the time to make sure their code was bulletproof, easy to read, commented, and you know, they were actually proud of what they'd done. That's the big thing. I don't think a lot of programmers are proud of what they do. They're just 9-to-5ers, I guess, walk in. This is a craft. Um, I'll get into that in a second here. Develop a scripting standard to go by. It doesn't have to be ridiculous. I've got a do's and don'ts document I put together. It's 40 pages in length now, because I also put in how I want it done. And I'm one of the guys who puts together the standards for our ServiceNow business unit. You know, I don't get into the nitty gritty on JavaScript. JavaScript standards, there's a dozen of them out there I could point to. We adopted more or less the one that I think it was for Airbnb has got a good one out there that I think we're using right now. I'd have to go back and look. Basically, JavaScript standards are not what I'm talking about here. This is stuff that has to do with coding inside ServiceNow. So develop a ServiceNow scripting standard. Point to an external JavaScript standard if you want. But you know, a lot of the things I brought up in this are in our document. This is what I don't want. This is what I do want. And then implement a peer review. This doesn't have to be a senior person doing a junior person's you know, code. This is a you know, someone else who's a developer, another set of eyes on the code. Simplify your code reviews. I've done this with our BU. I've just implemented a weighting system. So I've got a 1 to 5 weighting on, you know, worst case to best case kind of stuff, or best case to worst case. You know, if comments are missing, it's a 1. If a lot of comments are missing and it isn't obvious what's going on, it's a 2, you know, that kind of stuff. It can be your own scale. So if you get something, let's say it's above a 15 total number of points on it, it needs addressing. If it gets over 20, it needs serious eyes on it to go back and clean it up. If it's in the 30s, I usually go after them. And they have a what we used to call a career development day. Do you really want to be a developer for our company? Build these peer reviews into your project so you have the time to do them. And then internalize the stuff. Build solid, well-engineered, maintainable code. This is a very achievable thing in a very short amount of time, no matter what pressure you got on you. It is just a matter of deciding that you will have this. If your business unit comes back to you and says, we need you to speed up everything, you know, cut corners, you know, I'll tell you, that will bite you and bite you and bite you. Or your customer will come to you and say, what kind of code are you writing? Or, you know, and so on. Anyway, you got that idea. It's not going to be done in a black box, folks. You know, ServiceNow does not hide its code. And so anything you write is visible to everyone who comes in, who's an admin. All right, so build solid code, do the right thing. You know, remember maintainability and take into account the failures. Make sure that you've got stuff to handle it. It's a craft. You know, it really is. Coding well is a craft. And my admonition is, you know, get out there and learn the craft. Maintainability, you know, it's got to be reasonably sensible. Don't make 35 and 40 character variable names. That's insanity. Make it reasonably done so that's easy to maintain. And then structure your code. We'll get more into the structure side in other sessions. Got a few resources. These are articles I've written out there on the community. You can go find them. And we are going to make this deck available so that you can have it for your records. These are articles I've written in the past on best practices for doing things. And then my overall articles list. Okay, any other questions? That's the end of this.
I'm waiting to see if we've got any more questions.
Again, we'll be covering more sophisticated ways of doing things, other problems, and I'll be bringing up code snippets I've found and then how to solve them.
Oh, yeah, great job, great session. The next one will be on May 23rd.
No, yes,
Yes,
May 23rd.
May 23rd will be part 2. We just decided that today.
Yeah, we just did. Yeah.
And then we'll have most likely a part 3 on June 6th. So
Yep.
Stay tuned, and we hope that you see everyone or see Stephen. Say hello to him if you're at Knowledge. And waiting for more questions, or you can always post your questions on that community link. The video is available on demand to rewatch it again. And Stephen will be answering questions even on that thread if you have other questions in the future.
And I'll be at the Accenture booth both Tuesday and Wednesday. I'll be a secondary instructor in pre-conference service mapping. So if you happen to be in the class, it'd be great to see you. Otherwise, I'll be at the Accenture booth or over at the community booth helping out Lisa and her crowd to just say hi to people.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.